So I was actually on the Google AI team, right? And my frustration was that there were so many tools being built out internally, but there was nothing for this 80-90% of the data scientist job, which is basically just EDA and making sure that the model's production quality is good. And there was nothing there. We were just using Python scripts and Excel sheets. So even now that all of those tools that we had have now been productized into what's called Vertex AI. And it doesn't have anything yet which is focused on how do you identify what's putting the model performance down and how do you
Mm.
diagnose and how do you explain what's going on there.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Data Scientist Show. Today we have Vikram Chatterji. Vikram is the co-founder of Galileo, an AI diagnostics and explainability platform used by data science teams building NLP, large language models, and computer vision models across the Fortune 500 and high-growth startups. Prior to Galileo, Vikram led product management at Google AI, where his team built models across retail, financial services, healthcare, and contact centers. He has a master's degree from Carnegie Mellon University from the School of Computer Science. Today, we'll talk about diagnostics of large language models, how to avoid hallucination, projects you worked on at Google AI, and his career journey. If you like the show, subscribe to the channel, give me a 5-star review, and leave a comment. Welcome to the show, Vikram.
Thank you so much, Aliana. It's so good to be here.
So, how did you get into machine learning?
I accidentally fell into it, is the short answer. Because in undergrad, I was studying human computer interaction. I was really interested in the education space. There was this professor at Carnegie Mellon who was doing some really great work in the world of technology enabled education. And I reached out to her, and she was kind enough to offer me an internship. And I flew into the US for the first time for that. And it turns out that that was the Language Technologies Institute, the LTI Institute at Carnegie Mellon. And that was basically all NLP. And I had no idea what I had just fallen into. And I realized that. And that's when I was asking them about the project that they were working on. It turns out that she's talking about how they were building what they called a cognitive tutor, which just means that it's for kids. And it just meant that a kid can ask a question and the tutor is going to automatically give a response. And that blew my mind. I had so many questions about how's that going to happen? Are there a bunch of if else statements behind the scenes that they're like, no, 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 it's a bunch of data. We train the data and then it's going to give the response and the machine just learns automatically. And that blew my mind. And that was my first foray into natural language processing. And I went back to my university and I was just shouting from the rooftops about the gospel of NLP and computer vision and machine learning. And I realized that back then it was still very early in terms of adoption. But the second wave, I think, that happened in the world of NLP and machine learning in general was the advent of transformers as a technology from Google. And that's when I really started to get excited about it because I also care about where you can build true applications for the industry. And I realized that transformers had heavily reduced the barrier to entry for people to use all of the text and documents around them for really interesting use cases. And so I guess my second foray into machine learning was when I was leading product management at Google AI, where we started to get all of these requests from large organizations where they were saying that, look, we have all of these documents, we have all of these images. Can we do something about this? 80% of our data is unstructured. All we're using is 20%, which is tabular. Can we do something about the 80% here? And we said, sure, yeah, there are ways to do this. And that's kind of how I got into it for the second time, where I was just, again, blown away by how many advancements were made in this and how useful it was for people and how it was just completely augmenting how people were doing their regular jobs. Analysts could do their jobs faster. The software
Mhm.
engineers now, as you can see, can do their jobs faster. It's just been such a huge step function improvement for people's lives.
Yeah. So, a lot of data science teams are interested in putting large language models in production to use it to solve problems. You worked on Google AI before, and you know there's a difference between um, doing research and putting models in production. So, what are the challenges in putting large language models in production?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the top of mind thing for a lot of practitioners, data scientists who are trying to create LLMs or build different kinds of models and put them in production has been threefold, in my opinion. One has been around the accuracy, that how do you make sure that you can trust your models in production, and how do you make sure that the accuracy of the model is actually really high. The second one has been around cost, especially with LLMs now. It's become more of a top of mind issue, just because most people are still using OpenAI. It's changing. People are using a lot of open source LLMs too, but the per API call cost can be quite high, especially when you start to think about the scale that you need for enterprise adoption. And the third one is privacy. This is again to some extent to do with the fact that OpenAI is a closed source system, and so folks have challenges in terms of sending their data outside of their premises. So how do you make sure that the data that you're leveraging with these models is not being used by these model creators for then for further training and improving their own models? So those are the three big top of mind things that I've heard over and over again. How do you make sure it's accurate? How do you make sure it's being done at a in a cost optimal way so that the operations cost isn't so high that the ROI doesn't
Mm,
make sense? And the third one is just privacy.
yeah. And let's start with the first one. The traditional way we measure machine learning models doesn't quite apply to measure large language models because it's generating new content. In order to
Right.
address those challenges, we first need to measure that. So, how should data scientists diagnose large language models?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's something which is very close to my heart because there have been experiences in the past where anybody who's built out models would have had these kinds of scar tissues where you've built something out, you put that out in production, and then it starts to fail. It starts to fail on some specific kinds of queries that users are making, or it starts to fail on specific kinds of data cohorts of people that you just didn't have enough training data for. I guess an example, I remember when I was working at Google, we were working with a large customer and we were building out this model for them. It was in the financial services space, and they were trying to uh, mention if, hey, should we be giving loans for specific kinds of small businesses? That was the model's prediction: yes for a loan or no for a loan. And we realized when we put the model in production very quickly that it was actually not performing well at all for female-owned small businesses in a
Mm,
large part of the US. And that was very bad because imagine the customer experience was there's some female-owned business and they're trying to get a loan and they're constantly getting rejected. And
yeah.
the root cause of that was the fact that when the model was being trained, it didn't have enough data for female-owned businesses because percentage-wise, those were just lower. And we would have realized that if we had diagnosed the model ahead of time and quality checked it for different kinds of slices of data. So, all of this is to say that model diagnosis is really important and it's often overlooked. I think, especially with LLMs now, that's just happening where folks are just picking up the OpenAI API and putting it into production almost, or just tuning it slightly with tuning the prompts slightly. So there's a lot to do on the diagnosis side. Some things that I've seen folks do today are just there are some metrics on the LLM side, like the Rouge score or the BERT score. Those are
Hmm.
very common scores that people use. They're not very effective in terms of identifying the overall model performance and accuracy. uh, the other thing I've just seen, because those are not very effective, the other thing I've seen people do is just eyeball the outputs from the model and try to figure out where it's working, not working, and thumbs up, thumbs
Yeah.
down. You'll see a lot of, there's so many tools these days, very lightweight tools which people have built out, and that's exactly what they're doing. They're looking at the output and just thumb down, thumbs up. Um,
Hmm.
so I think there's a big need right now in the market for being a bit more quantitative in terms of how do you identify whether this is a right prompt for LLMs, or even if you're training with your own data, to how do you debug that and how do you figure out that, look, amongst the training data that I've used, is it biased in some way? Do I need more training data of a certain type? Do I need less? That's an entire stack that needs to be built out, and I think people are getting very aware that that needs to happen, especially because they're not reaching the levels of accuracy that they need in order to actually productionize these systems.
Hmm. So you talk about some ways that evaluating LMs that are not working very well. So what are some other ways that works better when it comes to evaluating LMs? For example, what are some metrics you propose?
Yeah, so there are quite a few things that you could do. Something which at Galileo we have a huge research team as well. And something which we've always been thinking about is how do you start to diagnose the data and quantify this with different kinds of metrics. So, one metric which we've worked on for a bit and it's already live in our product for the last few years is called the data error potential score. This is especially useful for folks if you're familiar with NLP. People who are building out natural language processing models, they're, as an example, for contact centers, right? Like this caller just called. Is this a call for, let's say, the credit card was not working, or is this call more because they need a new credit card? And those are two labels that the model's trying to decide between. And so one of the metrics which we built out is called the data error potential score, which can essentially look at how confused was the model as it was trying to converge towards a particular label. And that DEP score, as we call it, has been very effective in terms of finding the long tail of data that was pulling the model performance down. That becomes important because otherwise, most people are using the model confidence score in those cases, which is especially in the research world and amongst practitioners, it's known to be a very bad metric for data quality because it's the model being very confident about its own output. Um, so a metric like that can be very helpful. The DEP score is based on a bunch of different factors, including the area under the margin score. And those can be very effective in trying to find out whether the model is very confused. That's one. Now, in the world of LLMs, especially when it comes to prompting and prompt engineering, as what a lot of people are doing now, you're not really dealing with labeled data at that point necessarily, right? So something which I've seen being very helpful is how can you identify whether a model is potentially hallucinating. And so again, over there, we saw that there was no metric there. So we built out Galileo's team. We built out the hallucination metric, where we can identify with a fairly large degree of confidence that, hey, is this model's output potentially hallucinating or not? And I think those kinds of quantitative measurements are very powerful to be able to identify and debug the prompts, but also the data that you're training with.
Yeah. And you mentioned quite a few metrics. And for listeners who want to maybe dive into the definition and math of it, how can they, what are some resources they can go check later?
Yeah, on the Galileo blog, there's a lot of articles that have been written about this. There's a lot of really interesting articles in this journal called The Sequence about this. There's quite a few folks who've been writing quite frequently about what these different scores are all about, but also about a lot of the terms that have come up with large language models, whether it's RLHF and reinforcement learning, or this like how do you use vector databases, etc. So I would suggest like going to some of these journals have been very helpful in terms of not just learning about the terms, but also learning about what's the latest and greatest in terms of tools, open source solutions, etc. They've been really, really useful.
So you mentioned measurement for hallucination. For folks who are not familiar with this concept, can you tell us what is model hallucination?
Sure. So at a very high level, you can think of model hallucination as just like if you said a human is hallucinating, it's similar, right? It's basically a model that's being overconfidently incorrect about something. And you ask a user, like, what's the color of the wall behind me? And as you can see, there's a glass window, but instead the model might say, I'm super sure this is a blue colored wall. That's the model hallucinating. That's the high level understanding of it. Now, mathematically, when you think of these large language models, right, they're basically sequence to sequence models. And so what that means is every single time you ask it a question, what it's trying to do is it's trying to come up with what's the first word and then what's the second word. These are all tokens. And so essentially, it's trying to, the LLM learns the probability distribution of the next token conditioned on the previous tokens. It tries to figure out what should the next word be or the next
Mm.
subword be. And so essentially, As a part of that, what happens is if it has insufficient training data of that type, for instance, in my example over here, if it wasn't trained on data around colors of the wall, it would not have the right kind of information to be able to say that, this should be the next token, right? And so it's going to say something like the color of the wall is blue because it's just coming up with something, but actually the probability of it thinking about the next, coming up with the next token was quite low. So
Yeah.
that's what leads to model hallucinations. It's mostly because either there was insufficient or just um, incorrect training data in the first place, or if the prompt instruction in the question itself, that is the query itself, was incorrect. So those are
Hmm.
some of the reasons why hallucinations can occur.
Yeah. And I think when it comes to measure the hallucination, it would be natural to use some of the probability, right? Can you share more about the metrics when it comes to measure hallucination?
Yeah, so something which we've found to be very helpful, and there is again an article we wrote about this, and happy to share with the listeners here, was using the minimum log probabilities of the model. This is basically the minimum value over the model's log probabilities that the model provides for the tokens that it's generating.
Hmm.
And this metric it's a very simple metric to leverage. It's also costless to compute, which is important because you want to be able to use metrics that don't are not expensive. And if it's a very low value, that means that the model is potentially hallucinating. So that's a very simple metric. That's one of the different ingredients into Galileo's overall hallucination metric. But I do suggest people try to use that because that's been helpful for us to find potential hallucination. It's obviously very difficult to determine that it's just 100% hallucinated or not, but it's been useful to see what the minimum log probabilities are at the token level. The other thing which I've seen being which is really interesting that people have started to use, and we use this as well. If you're using an OpenAI model which has closed weights, it doesn't have its weights exposed to the world yet, it becomes difficult to get these log probabilities for those kinds of
Right, the
models.
token level probabilities.
Exactly. Yeah, those are hidden from the users, right? So, what do you do in those cases? How do you identify a potential hallucination in those cases?
Hmm.
So, what you've noticed there is, you can, and I've seen some research about this, you can generate multiple completions of the same prompt that's coming up by asking ChatGPT whether it agrees with a different LLM. And so, like if ChatGPT says that it doesn't agree with the output of this LLM that you're using, then that could suggest a potential hallucination as well. And so you can do this multiple times with multiple different kinds of models. And basically, it's similar to like a labeler agreement, if you will, which is what people use in NLP to figure out, like, hey, is this the right label or not? Similarly, but just using multiple LLM outputs to figure out, hey, is this potentially hallucinating or not? So this can be useful, but at the same time, because you're maybe making API calls to ChatGPT and a few other LLMs for every single prompt, it can be costly to do that. But these are some interesting results and experiments that we've seen work fairly well. And a lot of this has been baked into the Galileo product as a hallucination metric.
Yeah. I read the blog post you shared with me and a link to a research paper. So the metrics you mentioned using the token level probability, it call it a gray box measurement because it's not completely black box. You have access to token level probability, but for if you're using ChatGPT, it doesn't output the token level probability. It's kind of like a black box model. And to measure this, you can use to generate a few outputs and then to see whether they agree with each other. So basically, to see whether they form certain consensus, and you can use both metrics together. Um, so
That's right.
if if we are able to diagnose and detect hallucination using the metrics, what's the next steps? How can we address it?
Yeah, so it what I've seen people do quite a bit is you'd first try to just tune your prompts by making sure that you're using the right instructions, the right examples, etc. So that's a very big part of this, right? So when it comes to diagnosis, it's you're either diagnosing the prompts, in my opinion, or you're diagnosing the context that you're using
Mm,
and you're providing to the model for every single prompt, or you're trying to fix and diagnose the data while you're fine tuning your model. All of this is happening as you're trying to build out the LLM. So the first one for the prompting, we've talked about this a little bit, where model hallucination becomes really important. There needs to be metrics to quantify what's the right prompt, and you also need like a really good, like intelligent bench, if you will, where you can organize, evaluate, and monitor all of your prompts over time. The second thing becomes trying to identify context, and especially for business use cases, you have a lot of your own context. Like for instance, if you're a bank, let's say you're a very large bank in the US, and you've built out a large language model powered chat solution, and a lot of users are coming and using it now. And let's say one user says, let me know what's the closest branch to my address, and this is my address. And if the model spits out and says, here's the closest Taco Bell near you, that's obviously wrong. But from a model's perspective, that is a branch, that's a Taco Bell branch.
mm,
Versus what you actually wanted to do is just give you the right branch for that bank, which means that you have to kind of start to make the model a bit more contextual for your specific use case, for your specific business. And that's where a lot of teams I've noticed have been using retrieval augmentation using vector databases. And that's where vector databases like Pinecone and Chroma and VV8, etc., there's a whole bunch of them. They've become really popular to do that because now for every single call that you're making with a prompt, you can go and fetch just the right kind of context and supplement that so that the model now knows exactly what you're talking about, and the response that
mm,
it gives you is probably going to be a bit more contextual. But even there, right, from a diagnosis perspective, what we've seen as a big bottleneck amongst when you talk to customers is these vector databases are really great at being databases, but they're not necessarily providing you with the right kind of context, right? They're providing you with some context, but then the question becomes, how do you diagnose that and figure out the context that you provided, is this the right one or not? I need more
yeah.
context of a certain nature. How do you find similar data to the one that you just provided? That becomes really important to diagnose. The third thing becomes the fine tuning piece, where you have a lot
Mm,
of your own data. Can you fine tune these LLMs to create necessarily your what you can call your smaller language model basically on your side, but it's a customized language model of your own. So this large bank, let's say, that I was giving an example for, if they fine-tuned an LLM on their own data, they could create
yeah.
their own version of this model. And I think a
Mm,
combination of those three things can lead to some really powerful models, where you can go from like a just using an off-the-shelf OpenAI model, which will maybe get you like 70%, 80% of the way there, which is why people are so excited about it. But that's not good enough for enterprise use cases. You need to prompt tune it, you need to fine tune it with your own data, you need to add the right context. And that's when, after all of that rigor, is when you get to actually like maybe 90, 95% of the way there, so that you can say that, right, now I'm going to put this in production. I can trust this to go in production. But then once it's in production, as we know, as our listeners probably know this as well from experience, when you put a model in production, that's when the fun starts, because it was trained on X, but now it's coming from it's
mhm,
seeing all this other stuff. So how do you monitor that in production and get to know that, ooh, I probably need to tweak it, there are some new kinds of prompts coming up, etc., etc. So
mhm,
that becomes the next step for people once they actually productionize something.
mhm. Yeah. So you worked with a lot of customers. So do you see any patterns in developing large language models and putting them in production? For example, you mentioned usually they use some models developed by OpenAI, and then maybe they build their own models, usually smaller, with their more domain knowledge, specific context, and then test it in production. Or what are the other steps here?
Yeah, so I feel like there have been a couple of different patterns, and I must caveat this by saying that this is changing so quickly that
Mm-hmm.
yeah, almost every couple of weeks, people are learning more things, and they're tweaking the processes. And I feel like in 6 months from now, if somebody listens to this conversation, they're probably going to say, wow, this is ancient, because so much has changed in those 6 months.
Yeah.
So what we've seen in the last maybe 6 months to 12 months is a huge shift from folks over relying on just the uh, OpenAI models. That was like the 100% of people were using that, maybe about maybe 6 to 8 months ago. To increasingly, people are starting to adopt more open source models. That's been one big shift that we've noticed. And the reasons for that are, one is it gives them a little bit more control, because they can control the weights and they can see the weights and the logits, etc. And in the other piece, there is being able to, as a result of that, personalize that quite a bit for their own use cases by fine tuning it further. Um, but the big reason for the shift is has been privacy, because a lot of large enterprises, I guess they don't trust OpenAI necessarily with their own data, because it's going to Microsoft or something like that, and so they've been using a lot of open source language models and then fine tuning that. So that's been a
Mm.
very big change that we've seen happening, which is very similar to what happened with the world of mobile a long time ago, right? Where iOS came around with this great phone, and then Android started this open source system, and then it turns out a lot of other people in the world started to pick up Android phones, building their own versions of the open source software, but powered under the hood by Android. And so we're seeing the same thing happening now, where you have Llama that came out of Facebook. And on top of Llama, you had a bunch of different other smaller models, if you will, where you must have maybe heard of a lot of these examples where people were like, GPT-4 was cost OpenAI billions of dollars, but
Yeah.
our researchers came up with this model with $200, and it's
Mm.
it's fantastic. But it's because you're also standing on the shoulders of giants to be able to do that. You're basically using open source models and then fine tuning that, and it's that's great. But that's exactly the way we would expect the world to be moving. So at steady state, I feel like what's going to start happening is you'll probably have a mix of people who are using just OpenAI models off the shelf, and then you'll have a lot of enterprises gravitating more and more towards open source models. Um, so that's one big thing that we've been seeing with our customers. The second thing has been a little bit more of a maturation journey, if you will, like
Yeah.
just going from like just here's the API, just throw that out there in production, let's see what happens, to people starting to think of prompt engineering as a first class citizen of their workflow. And
Mm.
more and more people have started to come to us and ask us for our what we call our LLM studio, where we have this prompt engineering workbench where you can you know build and manage and quantify hallucinations pretty quickly, and collaborate on these prompts very fast. And so that's become a very big part of the workflow now, across a bunch of different enterprises who are trying to work with these open source models, especially. Um, and then the third thing is fine tuning with your own data. That's also starting to become more and more popular. But I feel like it's all starting to come together now. It used to just be throw the OpenAI model out there, let's see what it comes out with. Prompt engineering became really big. Now fine tuning is becoming more and more popular. Vector databases have become very popular. So finding the
Mm.
right context has become really important. So we're seeing the world mature in this direction faster than ever before. But I feel like it's still very much in flux. I will caveat all of this by saying that I haven't seen too many companies who've built out um, first class citizen LLM powered apps in production. A lot of larger enterprises are toying with their LLMs in for internal facing use cases.
Mm.
And like healthcare and financial services companies, for instance, have been pretty hesitant to just deploy something in production. And that's
Yeah.
because of what we talked about before, right? They're not sure about the accuracy. Like, can we trust this
Mm.
out there in the public, or is this gonna go out there and tarnish our brand and lead to disinformation? It's a real problem that people are trying to be very careful about.
Right. And even if they do, they probably need a lot of human in the loop, and that might not immediately
Yeah.
reduce their current cost. Thanks for sharing that. And you mentioned LLM Studio, and I know you previously mentioned Galileo. And for folks who are not familiar with Galileo, can you tell us more about it? And then what is LLM Studio?
Yeah, for sure. So you can think of Galileo as that diagnostics and explainability layer that is we felt like was completely missing in the stack. And it works for natural language processing. It works for computer vision models as well as now for LLMs. And so on the NLP and computer vision side, for instance, if you're working and building those models, it's likely that you have some kind of a labeling tool and that you're using to label the data. But when you're training the data, how do you find out the data that's pulling the model performance down, and how do you then try to fix that and iterate on it over and over again, and how do you
Mm,
make sure that you're monitoring that in production? So Galileo for NLP and computer vision basically kind of helps in increasing the rate by which you can iterate in the models during the R&D phase by automatically providing the data to you where the model performance was bad. And this could be because it was mislabeled, or it could be because the data was in a different language or something else. We automatically detect mislabeled samples and label overlaps and just the long tail of data that is pulling the model performance down, which dramatically reduces the amount of time it takes for data scientists to diagnose what's going wrong with the model in the R&D phase. And then we also have production monitoring and model observability. So it's a complete stack essentially for you to diagnose and explain what's going wrong with the model. And so you have peace of mind that the model is always going to be working with a high degree of accuracy
mm,
in production. Now, what we've seen is with the advent of LLMs, right, the NLP stack has started to change, number one. And number two, it's opened so many use cases around summarization and generation of text that a lot of companies who were not even doing NLP before have now started using LLMs just to summarize their documents and to have a customer facing chatbot now. And the stack we noticed was that you need for LLMs was different. And that's where LLM Studio comes in, where it's the same thing. It's the diagnostics and explainability layer, but for LLMs. And so you can manage your prompts, figure out if they're hallucinating or not, collaborate with your colleagues, as well as
mm,
fine tune your data and debug the data that you're fine tuning with in the same product, as well as monitor your LLMs in production. It's a complete enterprise ready stack for LLMs so that you can make sure and sleep at night that your models are actually doing fine in production. And if it's not, then Galileo is going to automatically identify that and ping you about it.
mhm. And is there any open source version of Galileo for data scientists to use?
It's not open source, but there is going to be a free version of the LLM Studio. So if you go to the rungalileo.io website, you can access the waitlist there for the product. But we've just given the number of developers that are working on this right now, we took the stance of making a very large side of the product free for anybody to sign up and use. Um, the algorithms that we've built out, we've been very open about the math that goes into it because that's the
Mm,
if number one question that folks have. So we've written up docs about that, and we also have been publishing papers just to be very open about the experiments which we use to identify mislabeled samples, identify label
mm,
overlaps, or the data error potential score, and also now the hallucination score that we have. So we've been very open about where it shines, where it needs more work. So in that sense, I wouldn't say that's necessarily open source, so to speak, but it is in the public domain. So we have extreme transparency there.
yeah. And I know a lot of data scientists might want to ask. I do a lot of diagnostics on my own, and I have my own
Yeah.
scripts. I know my model. Why do I have to use a tool to do this instead of writing everything on my own?
Yeah. So I think the big difference there is even at my team at Google AI, right? Everybody has to do this. Everybody has to do what's called EDA, the exploratory data analysis, and try to
Yeah.
understand what's going wrong with the data. Right? It's a big part of what data scientists do today. Is it fun? Not really, right? What we've seen with my team at Google AI as well was if you look over the shoulder of a data scientist that's working at most of the time, you won't see any of these bright and shiny tools that are out there for labeling or training and deployment, etc. It's mostly just it's just Python scripts in a notebook, or it's going to be Excel sheets if you're working on a natural language
Mm,
processing task, for instance. And we're seeing the same thing happening with large language models as well, where they're just using sheets and trying to eyeball the outputs and trying to see where does it goof up, where does it not. Um, I think that's the problem with NLP and with computer vision, with these kinds of, especially when you're working on these use cases for your business, it becomes really important to have the right kind of tools so that you don't miss out on the long tail of problem points. And for the most part, what we've seen is if you look at the data scientist workflow today, they're just constantly tweaking things out and creating scripts in notebooks so that they can find different kinds of data anomalies. There's only so far that you can go with something like that, and it's not organized in one place. I think of this in a
mm,
similar way to if you think of when folks were writing code, right? Like if you didn't have a proper IDE for writing
yeah.
code and debugging the code and trying to figure that out, it'd be really, really hard. And so think of Galileo as it's providing that IDE interface for you, but it's going one step further and also having this co-pilot for you to automatically diagnose and detect these kinds of anomalies and issues. It's a step function difference in the way people are operating, all the way from like scripts and notebooks to having a really strong interface to be able to organize everything in one place, collaborate with your teammates on this EDA process, and also automatically identify different kinds of alerts and give that to you as soon as you're finished with the training run. Our people who have used the product, they think of it as a complete paradigm shift from the way they were doing it before, and leads to like 20 to
Mm,
30% improvements in model performance within weeks of using the product, because you're leaving a lot of model improvement on the table by not going deeper into the data that's powering it. And that's the level of rigor that every team needs to have. Um, we're seeing the same thing transpire with LLMs as well.
yeah. And you mentioned when we put model in production, besides accuracy, there's also challenges in cost. So I'm curious, in Galileo, is there ways to identify the issues with, say, cost when it comes to training and inference?
Yeah, so cost is a metric that we've added into the LLM Studio because it's very top of mind for people. So something that we do is we know how much every API costs. So even before you can run a prompt, that's the Galileo lingo for productionizing. So every time you run a prompt, even before you do that, we can tell you that, look, based on the amount of data that you have and the kind of model that you're using, whether it's GPT-4 or it's a different open source model, based on those different entities, we can tell you that, hey, this is the likely cost of this particular run right now. So you can, if you see that it's very expensive, you can make those tweaks. So we've added a lot of these different kinds of layers into the product so that you can be very mindful of the overall cost that you have, that you're going to be incurring, as well as in production, automatically telling you that, look, this is how much it's costing you right now, and this is the projected cost in the future. Those are things which are very top of mind from a workflow and product perspective for Galileo.
Now you have seen a lot of players getting into large language models, trying to put in production. As you mentioned, it's still early. A lot of companies don't feel completely comfortable to put the models in front of millions of customers. So where do you think the market is going? Who is going to adopting large language models? Who, for what kind of industry it might take longer?
Yeah, I think there are, if you look at the different kinds of industries, you can almost have a scale of are these, what's the risk of the company to launch something, right? Like if you have a
Mm,
company that's purely catering to, let's say, fashion retail, maybe the risk there of launching something new and innovative is lower than a healthcare organization, which is trying to summarize patient records and make that available to the patient. I think the ones with lower risk are the ones which are coming out with newer, interesting kinds of LLM based applications very fast. Like you're seeing this with even application monitoring companies, right? Like there are lots of them in the market, and they've come up with their own chatbots to say that, if you want to monitor your own applications, just type in what you're trying to look for, and we'll give that to you in a dashboard. Are they always correct? Not at all. They're wrong quite often. does it matter so much? Not really, because their users have a very high degree of tolerance. So the low
Mm.
risk ones are the ones where we're seeing them go first, which is great because at least this is spreading the word that you can do this, the great use cases. And then they start to launch first and then tweak later, is the kind of paradigm that they've used. On the other side of the spectrum, we've been talking to companies who are in the financial services, insurance space, or banking sector, or healthcare space, in the cancer diagnostics, etc.
Hmm.
They are very careful about, number one, being HIPAA compliant all the way. It becomes really important for healthcare organizations. So, which are these LLMs compliant from that perspective is question number one. Question number two becomes what's the security and privacy story there, and then there's a huge regulatory battle to be won first for these organizations to even start to use LLMs. And once they do, then before they can productionize it, they'll have to go through all of the steps that we talked about before, and use something like Galileo to be able to make sure that you're prompting it correctly, you're fine tuning the right data, you are getting the right context from vector databases, etc. And then also once it is finally in production, you can monitor that completely consistently. So they're much, much more careful about putting something out there. So we're seeing a huge velocity in terms of people putting stuff out the door and their consumers using it for low risk kinds of organizations, as well as for a big bucket within that is just startups, right? Guys,
Mm.
read a statistic somewhere about how I think it was, what was it? I think one third, if not two-third, of the last Y Combinator batch of startups were all generative AI startups. They were all applications around this, whether it's
Yeah.
legal documentation summary or patient record summary or something else. There were a lot of apps being built out there. And these are all obviously people who are putting their apps in production. Uh, so I've seen a lot of really interesting use cases spin out there. So there's a lot of innovation that's come about. But when you talk to large enterprises, they'll tell you that they have 100 different ideas for their LLMs, but they have a lot of trepidation around um, which one should we go for so that it gives you the highest bang for the buck. But also number two,
Mm.
security, privacy, cost, accuracy. Those things are very top of mind for them. So they'll take a little while longer. So my bet is that in the next 12 to 15 months or so, number one, I feel that the hype of large language models and generative AI is going to go down a little bit because people are going to realize
Yeah.
that, wait, we actually need to be much better about the last mile of making sure that something can go out properly.
Yeah.
But I think the second thing that's going to happen is there'll be a huge proliferation of production models out there that are going to truly change the way people are interacting with different kinds of systems today. And it's only starting with large language models, and it's going to move into multimodal models as well very quickly around images and things like that. That's going to happen
Mm.
sooner than we think, I think.
Do you feel you're working more with developers who want to get into LMs, or they're data scientists, or there are analysts using LMs? So, what type of
Yeah.
persona are trying to get into those models in production and use cases?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's so fascinating because when we started out Galileo, right, we were focused
Mm.
on natural language processing and then computer vision and even for tabular data. And we saw that mostly people who were building out models there had titles like data scientist or ML engineers. And now with LLMs, I think it's because the barrier to entry is reduced so much, right? It's just an API call away.
Yeah.
So it's so easy that a lot of people are using LLMs are developers, and it's not rocket science to do prompt engineering, and but you need the right tools for it. So people are being able to kickstart that side of the process too very quickly. So the persona is changing quite a bit, and it's a mixed bag, a bit where on the one hand, it is the same NLP teams at organizations that were launching these NLP models are now pivoting, if you will, to the LLM stack. And so it's a bunch of data
Mm.
scientists and ML engineers there who are doing this. But then again, we also see especially in smaller companies, a lot of software engineers, analysts, like you said, just pinging these APIs, doing a little bit of prompt engineering, and then going to the next step and getting
Mm.
something pretty good out the door, which can work for like 70, 80% of the use case. So it's really fascinating how it's just reduced the barrier to entry by so much where you don't need a degree in data science to be able to use this anymore. You just need to be a savvy software engineer who's willing to learn just a little bit more about how you can tweak the model. It's much easier than before to be able to get into this space.
Yeah. And there are so many resources out there, tutorials, papers. It can be
Yeah,
overwhelming sometimes. Um, so, how do
yeah.
you continue to learn? Do you have some favorite resources you want to share with people who want to learn more about the field?
To be honest, for me, it's been what's been helpful is just to kind of start by following certain journals. I mentioned the Sequence, which I like a lot, which have a lot of very in-depth coverage about what's new, and through that you learn about new terms, about what's working, what's not working, and then honestly just going on YouTube and going to some really interesting channels to learn more about how that works and what the downfalls of that are. That's been very helpful. Apart from just also following some folks who are really great in the space, Jan LeCun and some others on Twitter.
Mm,
It's really surprising how much they share, like Andre Karpathy and others. They share a lot on Twitter and other places too. So it's really interesting to kind of hook into everything that they're talking about and what's coming out from these really good high quality publications. And then honestly just be also self teach yourself. I agree with you, there are lots of these LLM universities and others that have been coming out as well from different organizations. Google has uh, recently launched this free LLM university kind of an endeavor, which is I've heard from a lot of people being really good, and
mm.
people learned a lot there. So those are some really interesting avenues for folks to learn more about the space.
So you worked at Google, and I think Google has a lot of tools for their developers and data scientists. Did Google have something similar to Galileo?
They didn't. So I was actually at the on the Google AI team, right? And my frustration was that there were so many tools being built out internally, but there was nothing for this 80-90% of the data scientist job, which is basically just EDA and making sure that the model's production quality is good. And there was nothing there. We were just using Python scripts and Excel sheets. So even now, right, that all of those tools that we had were have now been productized into what's called Vertex AI, and it doesn't have anything yet which is focused on how do you identify what's putting the model performance down, and how do you
Mm,
diagnose and how do you explain what's going on there. So there's no focused product there on that side so far. And I think the big reason for that is the larger organizations focus a lot more on core infrastructure versus the diagnosis and explainability layer for models. So that's where we come in and can potentially partner with a lot of these organizations to make sure that their users can also get the advantage of using Galileo.
gotcha. Have you seen data scientists working on tabular use cases using large language models? For example, if I want to do some forecasting, previously I was using random forest or some neural networks. Will LLMs
Yeah.
change how I work? Are there new tools?
Potentially, yeah. I think that can absolutely happen. I've not seen that happen as rapidly as I have seen the move from NLP to LLMs, because that's a very natural,
Mm,
organic transition. But that being said, I have seen a lot of folks use LLMs on their tabular data as well. And the reason for that is it's essentially at the end of the day all about the tokens. It's all about the sequencing of tokens. And so as long as you have a use case around, like I said, maybe forecasting as well, right, where you're going to predict the next token, or you're trying to generate something, you can absolutely use them. And it's been interesting because initially I thought, like, it's generating things, it's summarizing things. That's where the use cases are going to lie. But even on the
mm,
NLP side, classification tasks are happening by using LLMs sometimes, by some developers. Just again, because it's so easy to use these APIs, they just are doing that for classification, for entity recognition, etc. So it's been surprising how the adoption of this is rapidly moving into domains outside of just generation and summarization. So I won't be surprised if it starts to affect how people work with tabular data. But I've not seen it happen as much as you would expect. Again, because the stack there is slightly different. You need a feature store and you have a whole host of features and you want to make sure that the quality of the features is good. The problems of diagnosis are slightly different there than if you're
Mm.
using LLMs. But who knows? People might migrate in that direction too.
Yeah. Do you remember what was your first project when you got into Google?
Oh, for me, I had two stints at Google. But the first time I joined Google was in 2013. I was a big Android nerd, and everybody else was buying iPhones, and I was buying Android. And
Mm.
I reached out to Google's Android team, and they offered me a job in the product management side. And that was my first project there. It's interesting. So I was, I guess, responsible to some extent for the short attention span that everybody has, because we were considering coming up with notifications for applications in the operating system. And one of the big things that we were all thinking about back then was, is this a good thing or is it a bad thing? And so
Mm.
um, that was something that I had worked on, and it was the first iteration of that was terrible because every single notification that you get was like pinging you constantly across all apps.
Yeah.
Then we had to make it more and more intelligent. The second time around when I joined Google was with I started working at this cloud AI, the Google AI organization, um, and there it was we started to work with a lot of enterprises, and that was very fascinating because the first few months I was just talking to a lot of enterprises to understand like what are the potential use cases of machine learning, and started to see that it wasn't just one or two or three, it was hundreds of different use cases, and that was extremely exciting. And I think now we're starting to see that play out more with large
Mm.
language models, where people are not just saying that, hey, I have hundreds of use cases, but getting to the next step with those hundreds of use cases has become so much faster as compared to even like
Yeah.
2 years ago.
So when you were at Google AI, did you talk to customers because you were building a internal tool, not like internal to a product later for the
Mhm.
customer, or you are like consultant partner with data science and developer to solve a problem for them using existing Google AI tools?
It was more of a product. So we were trying to see like um, should we help contact centers in getting more efficient with their operational costs by routing the different calls in the right direction by using NLP?
Mm.
Should we be working with healthcare organizations to um, automatically detect some certain very specific kinds of cancers in different kinds of pathology reports and give that back to the doctors? And so the reason I was talking to all of these folks was to see where can I find repeatable use cases where there
Mm.
is somebody who is working with a lot of data on like in a repeatable way and is also willing to adopt machine learning in the loop, if you will, of their workflow. So we started to, that's why I was talking to a lot of different organizations across retail, healthcare, financial services, contact centers. And we started to identify, like the certain use cases in financial services, there's certain use case in healthcare. And so we built these products, which were basically uh, pre-trained machine learning models, which you could then provide to these different enterprises leveraging an API. It was something that we could actually sell, which is where I realized that it's not easy. It's not easy to build out a pre-trained
Yeah.
model, and it's not easy to train the model. It takes a lot of work, and it's all about the data. It's not so much about the
Mhm.
model, really.
Yeah, it's interesting because I worked in a similar team when I was at AWS. I was working on a team called Machine Learning Solutions Lab. I don't know if it's still there. Uh, so what we do is more like consultant. We work with AWS customers to help them solve a machine learning use case. Sometimes we build custom
Yeah.
solution for them. Sometimes we leverage a product from AWS. And we also, after we finish a few projects, we also meet internally to understand what are some similar use cases across the customers. And then we will partner with a SageMaker, which is kind of similar to the Amazon version of Google Colab. We will
Yep.
give feedback to them, give them some ideas, what we learn from customers. That was a very fun experience because you learn so much from customers from different industries. And when we work with product managers from SageMaker, we also learn how kind of product leaders think about building something that not just for one customer, but across different customers from different industries.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think if you, for data scientists, if you have the opportunity to work with different customers, you don't have to be in that role forever, but being there for even 6 months or a year, you can learn a lot. And also, there's a different feeling working with external customers. It's not like when you work with internal teams, you can negotiate the deadline. If something doesn't work, you can go back, fix it. But
Yeah.
when you work with external customers, you have to be very careful about your commitment, and you need to think about, do I have their trust? What can I do to make them feel comfortable about the solution I propose?
That's right.
What were
Yeah.
some lessons you learned from working with customers?
I think to a large extent, kind of what you said before, where as a product person, as a product management person, for me, everything starts and ends with the customer, right? Like you have to, the number one thing is you talk to the customer. Number one thing is you understand what's your problem point. And as a data scientist or as any kind of a technologist, I think the superpower that we have is you can build things for them. So but the question number one is, what do you want and how do you identify the pain points that they have so that you can then start to think about how you can leverage LLMs or any of the other models to be able to fix them. So I guess number one was, how do you ask the right questions to your clients or to your customers so that they're not just giving you responses which satisfy you or that are trying to be nice, but how do you go beyond that?
Mm,
There's this really
yeah.
interesting book. I think it's called, what's it called, the Mom Project or something like that,
The
where
Mom
essentially what
Project?
it talks about the whole. I think that's what it's called. I'll have to look it up, but it's a really interesting book, and I'll try
Hmm.
finding the right book and share it with you later on. But the whole point of
Yeah.
the book was, a lot of times when you're talking to customers, it's very similar to if you're talking to your mom, where they'll tell you something like, "Of course, what you're saying is correct. Of course, what you're saying is awesome," and you go back thinking that you found out the problem, you understood what's going on. So the book is
Yeah.
it's really interesting because it starts to talk about how you can phrase the question with your customer in a way such that they're much more honest and brutal with their responses.
Mm,
So that was a very big learning for me, when you can ask a customer like, "Hey, do you like this?" Or you can ask the customer like something else, that, "Tell me 5 things you really dislike about this, and you won't hurt my feelings. In fact, if you say something bad about this, it's going to be better for my career. So tell me what you dislike." And I think those kinds of rephrasings were really important. And
yeah.
the other piece there is also understanding the priorities for the customer, like what's top of mind for you, and asking them like, if we fix this, is this like a 10% increment or 100% increment in terms of your day-to-day life? I think those kinds of questions are really important, and also having enough of a sample size of people that you talk to. So for me, it's all about the customer. And even with Galileo, it was the same thing. The first 3 or 4 months of the company, even after we had raised our initial seed round, we had thankfully had very good investors. We told them that we're actually not going to build anything for the next few months because we're trying to solve a very
Mm,
different problem, which there's no solution like this today in the market, which does this end-to-end diagnostics and explainability. So the first few months were just talking to hundreds of data science leaders across the world to identify what the core pain points were. So I think it's a very important skill to have, because our bias as builders, as data scientists, is just open up a notebook and start to make something. So I think refraining from that as much as possible and starting with what's the user need, the business need, is always a good step.
yeah. I really like the examples you shared about rephrasing your questions. I think data science can use the same thinking when we talk to stakeholders, when we get feedback from them. I've seen so many projects when data scientists present to stakeholders, and the stakeholder will say, "Yeah, that looks really cool," but in the end, they didn't use it.
Yeah,
Um,
that's right.
When you were at Google, was it a difficult decision to leave and start Galileo? How was it started?
That was yes and no, because in the back of my mind, I always knew that I wanted to start a company
Mm,
at some point. The question was twofold: with whom and what. And so the with who question, I thankfully had again the good fortune of having some really close friends who I've known for a very long time. They were also the machine learning space, really great engineering leaders at Google Speech, and the other one was at Uber's AI, like Uber AI, the Michelangelo team there. He was leading a very important project there, and that was great to kind of have that partnership with these two really great people. But the other piece there was for what, and in the back of my mind, I always knew that I wanted to, if I ever started a company, I wanted it to be in a domain which felt to me similar to the tectonic shift that we felt when you know cloud computing was becoming a thing, or when Android and mobile was becoming a thing in 2010. Like there were so many mobile apps all of a sudden everywhere. It didn't exist
mhm.
in 2007, 2012, whole different world, right? So many
Yeah.
apps on the Play Store and iOS. And so when I was at Google in 2020, 2019, 2020, machine learning felt like that. It started to feel like every company is building its own AI applications and machine learning applications. And then unstructured data felt like this huge swath of data. 80% of the world's data is unstructured. It's barely being used for ML. It just was felt obvious that models are going to get larger and larger, and it's going to get easier and easier to use them. And so knowing those two things, it became a pretty easy decision to leave and start. It was hard, obviously, because Google is an incredible place to work, and you learn so much from everybody around you. The scale of that, as you know from your experience at Amazon, those it's a the scale of an impact that you can make is very very large. Um, and starting a company is, to some extent, I think of it as the training wheels go off, and you're entering the real world, so to speak, and you better be creating something of high value. And but
Yeah.
it's a fascinating ride. So it was easy because I knew who I was doing it with and kind of what I wanted to solve for.
Yeah. Yeah, I know what you meant by entering the real world because even when I was at Amazon, sometimes I feel this is a continuation of some school or
School,
training in
yeah, yeah,
some sense. Yeah, I see it as an experience for me to learn a lot of things. Also, no, I wouldn't retire in Amazon. I probably at some point do something on my own. I wasn't exactly sure what is it. So when I left, I just felt,
yeah,
oh, I graduated from Amazon. Now it's the real world. There's no one fix your laptop when there's some small tech issues.
yeah.
And then
That's
they
right.
do a great job making you not worrying not worrying about everything else, and you can just like
Yeah,
do your work.
focus. Yeah,
Yeah. But
that's
we don't
very
have
true.
we didn't have like massages or food like
Baristas,
what Google does.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely missed my baristas and all of those other perks that you had when you're at Google. But it's a, I feel like it's a great place to go and learn for folks who are early in their career, especially. It's such a good place to learn the operational rigor and the processes that you can incur, because the level of leadership at these organizations is really high.
Mm,
I feel like it's really hard to find those kinds of places where you can learn anywhere else outside of these organizations. So it's great to learn, but at some point, if you have that inkling that you want to go into the real world, I feel like it's always good to try to do that. A lot of growth to be
yeah.
had there.
And do you have a mentor or manager, could be a peer that influenced you a lot in your career?
Yes, I think it's always important to have people who you look up to for whatever reason, right? So in my head, I've always had my own like personal board of directors, if you will. I've not
Yeah.
formalized it in such a way for to
Hmm.
the people who I talk to, but all through, right? Like it's not necessarily just for this person is great for product management. This person is great at this other skill. This person knows C++ really well. It's not like that. It's more about um, for me. It's more about things like when I just got out of grad school, right? I realized that my work ethic, I needed to work a lot on my work ethic. I really need to figure out how I can figure out time management was the big thing for me. And I realized that there's only so much time in the day. How do I do that? How do I be efficient? And I remember there was this my first managers at Android. There was so many things. There were a million things going on at Android. Everyone was working day and night. But how do you make the most of the day? There's this person who was still a great mentor, and she was great at time management and being efficient. And through that, I was very transparent with her and said, "I want to learn your ways. Tell me how you do this. You do 10,000 things in
Mm.
the day, and you do it really well." So that was great there. And similarly, when I went to Google Singapore to start a product for Southeast Asia a couple of years ago. There were some great product management leaders there, and I joined very early. So there was great mentorship in terms of understanding how that works really well. Uh, Google Cloud was a great experience because I could lead this team which was very industry focused. So learned a lot more, and my whole goal there was, can I learn from these specific people about how does sales work, how does partnerships work, how do you put something out there which is actually useful and can make money as a business. So I think across the board it's important to kind of figure out what you're trying to learn. And then it's what's been amazing to me is how when you go to people and ask them uh, and tell them that, look, I want to learn from you, it's the specific thing,
Yeah.
give me 30 minutes, people are surprisingly open to doing that. And I do the same now for anybody who comes to me and says, hey, the specific thing, I want to learn more from you. And I think we all pay it back.
Yeah. And I'm curious, what did your first manager shared about time management? Can you give us a few tips?
There were a lot of different tips. One thing which I really liked was there were some basic things like be better with your calendar and just like carve out time for different kinds of things in your calendar, be very meticulous about that. But there was something which I really liked and I try to do even till this day, which is carve out time for yourself. So think of it as the time of defense and the time of offense, right?
Mm.
So what that means is the time of offense is you have a bunch of emails, you're trying to respond to all of them, you have some deadlines, you're trying to creep up and finish that off. Keep that as a time block which you're working towards, 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever it's going to take. And that's your time of offense. You're really going after the specific things which are top of mind for you. So you're trying to get things done, trying to get some deliverables out. But then you should also have some time for defense. What that means is you take some time out on Fridays. That works best for me personally. Like Friday afternoons, evenings, keep 2 or 3 hours separate and just detach a little bit, maybe even go for a walk, have a notebook, and just write down your thoughts about what's working, what's not working. And this is, again, work related stuff, but even now, right? Again, as I run Galileo, a big part of this is where's the world going right now? What else can we do? How can we do things differently? And just noting those things down has been, and doing that kind of an exercise is great because then you start to think of so many things which are outside of your day to day, because
Mm.
otherwise we all have this risk of getting into this autopilot mode where you're just doing the same thing over and over again, and that's not
Yeah.
fun. Nobody likes that. And so it's nice to just break down the monotony, be by yourself. I always carry my notebook with me, and I'm always taking notes
Mhm.
there no matter what. That's been very cathartic, but also helps me think about starting the next week with fresh ideas and new
Yeah.
things which we can start taking up. So that helps you not fall into that trap of, you know, day to day monotony and incrementalism. You can make bigger strides and bigger changes that way.
Yeah, that's a great advice. I think there's always more to do, whether you are a startup founder or as a data scientist. And it's important to carve out time to reflect. It's like when you finish a project at work, you have those meetings to evaluate a project. I think we should also diagnose our
Yeah.
personal projects. Um, yeah, and also I'm curious. I remember when I was scheduling meetings with you for the podcast, um, you use Calendarly, and you're available every 30 minutes, I don't know, for the entire afternoon till like 7 p.m. So I was curious, for example,
Yeah.
I know you need to meet your customer. So if a customer schedule a meeting at 2:30 and another customer schedule a
Yeah.
meeting at say 3:30, and then you're in two different conversations and you have the 1 hour in between, are you able to do some focus work there? And I mean, your day is basically breaking into those small pieces. How can you get
Yeah.
anything done?
Yeah, that's actually a great point. I think it depends. So, like, if you're a data scientist or a developer, I feel like it's different because you you're not necessarily in the business of context switching too much. But
Yeah.
I think because I was in product management before, it's all about like context switching from like product number one to product number two. This one is in its early stages. This one is in its later stages. You're now talking to sales. Next step, you're talking to customer success. And so I think that's another skill which I feel like is a great life skill in general. Just how can you compartmentalize and how can you
Mm,
context switch? And it takes quite a bit of discipline and planning to be able to go from, like you said, like finished customer call number one. And typically in my head, I'm by the last 15 minutes, I'm already thinking about what's the next thing that I need to do and kind of conditioning my brain that, all right, I'm going to have to do X, Y, and Z. And it's like it's an offense thing where I have to give
mm,
this person this thing or this directive, and like that has to happen in the next 30 minutes. And that way I'm prepared mentally for that. But context switching, I feel like, is something which is super, super key for that. But I think the other piece here is also prioritization. And like you said, customer calls. For me, as a person running a company, customer calls are come above everything else. So if there's a customer call, then I'm going to say no to most other things. But the other thing for me, which is important, is just exercise and working out and making sure that I'm not just constantly falling into the trap of working nonstop and then eating badly. So
mm,
it's important for me to carve out like that 1 hour in the day for working out as well. And that's my sacred time where I'm going to detach my phone. So I think it's good to just have blocks which are just non-negotiable. Like nobody can take that away from you, while the rest of the day is kind of in flux and you're context switching constantly between different things.
mhm. And now, kind of looking back at your journey, what was the time that felt very challenging for you, and how did you overcome that?
Challenging for me. Well, as if I just think about the time as we're running the company Galileo, I think overall it's been just a lot of fun. It's been really nice to solve this problem for people, and it's resonating with a lot of people.
Hmm.
I think the challenge can be, I guess, in the earliest stages of a company, and I think every person who starts a company faces this. Um, it takes a while. I think of starting a company as it's like when you think of an iceberg, right? You can only see the tip of the iceberg and all the good stuff that's in its shining glory, and then there's all of this other stuff underneath the water that nobody talks about. And I feel like that, but that's the base. That's the base that's keeping the top alive. And I
Mm,
feel like in the beginning, all you're trying to do is create a very, very solid base. And because nobody knows about you, nobody knows that you've even started a company yet, which is a good thing. And so you can just solidify the base. And what I mean by that is making sure that you found the right people, making sure that you found the right kind of opportunity that you're truly passionate about, because it's like a 5 to 10 year journey at least. And then also validating that with people. So before I even started Galileo, it was like a 2 year journey to get to that point of conviction that these are the right people to
mm,
start it with. This is the right problem to go after, and getting to conviction on that point, and then starting to execute. So I feel like that can be challenging to keep the lure of building as far away as possible, and just focus on the first principles of, are these the right long-term partners, and is this the right long-term bet to be made, and then having a good sense of, is this the right kind of problem point, because you have to innovate and almost invent something as a company. That's the tough part.
yeah. So you said for 2 years you were just trying to understand the problem space to see if it's worth your investment in terms of time and energy. That's a long time, 2 years.
Yeah,
Did
so
you have
actually,
any doubts?
there were no doubts in my head that we wanted to start a company. I think the doubts were more about should we start a company? What should we start a company? Like, what should the company be about? And what's the main thesis? And I feel like it was a great journey because we went from something very different initially to unwrapping that more and more and more. And then also just looking around myself in my team at Google Cloud and in the Google AI team to see that these data scientists were basically looking at Excel sheets and scripts. And this is aha moment that I had once where I had asked my team about the F1 score in NLP has to be at least zero point 0.9, 0.95 before you get put in production, right? And I remember this time where we did this, we had all of this data that we had gotten, trained the entire model. We waited at least 2 or 3 days for the entire model to get trained. And then I was like, great, amazing. Are we there yet? And the F1 score was really low. It was zero point 0.6 or something. And my
Mm,
question was, can we understand why that's happening? And their
yeah.
answer was, no, we're probably going to have to now look up Excel sheets and scripts and stuff. And they handed me over this huge Excel sheet with like 1,000, 2,000 different rows. And they're like, now you go figure it out. And I was like, this is ridiculous. So I feel like it was this constant journey of coming to that point of conviction. But when you do, then it's kind of saying like, all right, this is it. Let's now go for it. So we definitely had pivots even before we started the company. But I think that's a good thing because you should be very, very convinced. Versus I've also seen the opposite approach where folks are like, I just want to start a company, I'm going to quit, and then we're going to use 6 to 8 months to just figure out what this is supposed to be. I guess you just need a bigger risk appetite to do that. But
Mhm.
my approach was slightly different. It was to just take the time we need to figure out whether it's the right pain point or not.
Yeah, yeah. And what was the important feedback you ever got from people you work with?
I've been lucky enough to have people who have been very honest and brutal with their feedback, which is honestly very, very good because it's people who care about you are the ones who mostly give feedback.
Yeah.
Um, I think something which has been very helpful was this idea of, again, maybe it's similar to the whole offense and defense thing again, like just
Mm,
thinking about and it also applies to careers where it's good to think very short term and long term at the same time. And what I mean by that is early in your career you're always thinking short term, right? Like there's an assignment here, there's a project here, let's get this done, get this done, get this done. The next vacation you're taking is like, all right, it's going to be 4th of July is coming up, this is my next break. Do you know what you're going to be doing in November? No idea. I'm just going like 1 month at a time. And some feedback that I got from some mentors who were about 15, 20 years older than me was carve out some time for also thinking long term. And that applies to so many things, is what I realized, because it applies to how you think of your career. Think about 20, 30 years from now and where do you want to be? Like you said with
mm,
Amazon, you were like, I'm not going to retire here. Great. All right. What does that mean for you now? What skills do you want to get so that you can move in the right direction?
yeah.
Um, and so that's something which I feel like I was to not do really well. I was to be very much focused on the near term versus, especially with company building, you have to constantly be in two modes almost at the same time. And you have to constantly be thinking about the here and the now, but also at the same time, the 1 year from now picture, the 2 year from now picture. And
Mhm.
I feel like that's a very healthy way of thinking about things, and the long term view can influence the short term view quite a bit.
Yeah. So now, what do you think about the future of your career? I mean, obviously, you're going to continue to run Galileo. What is something beyond that, or what is something you're particularly excited about?
Right now, it's just this one baby that I have, the company, and it's everything. It's in a space where we feel like it's as long as there's data involved, the problem of diagnosing it is not gonna go away, and that's something which is interesting for us because it's not a 10-year problem, it's not a 20-year problem, it's even larger than that. It's just the form factors are going to change. Today there's LLMs, tomorrow there'll be something else. So for me, I see this just evolving in that direction, and I just want to become an increasingly better leader to people who are in the organization. And again, like even our team members in the organization at Galileo, they're very open to giving me feedback constantly, which has been very helpful. If there's ever a life after Galileo, then it'll probably be another company at some point, focusing on a different problem. I'm a builder
Yeah.
at heart. I like to make things with great people, and it's addictive.
I think it's a relatively healthy addiction. And
Yeah,
now you're worked in very large organizations like Google, and you founded startups, and you probably know
yeah,
other founders, and also some data scientists and engineers are facing layoff from the large
yeah.
organization. They're considering joining startups. And can you give some advice? So when someone's evaluating whether a startup is worthwhile to join, what should we look for?
Yeah, great question. I think there are a few ways to think about that. One is the big difference between a large organization and a small organization is if you don't like the org that you're in within the large organization, you can just move, right? I'm
Mm,
taking the example of Amazon. I've never worked there, but
yeah,
if you worked on Alexa, you don't like it, you can go to, I don't know, Amazon Music or something like that, and it'll be a whole different world altogether, different culture, different people, different cafeterias, everything's different. But
yeah.
you can't do that in an early stage company. So I think that the first thing that I've always biased and have thought about people first, right? And so your so much of your life is going to be working, is going to be all about the work. So you might as well work with the right kind of people. So I think that's number one. Make sure that the immediate group of people that you'll be working with are people that you really enjoy. That there's this notion of what's called the aeroplane test, where the airport test, where you and we do this in our interviews as well at Galileo, where if you talk to a person, can you imagine being that person at an airport, sitting there waiting for a flight and having a great conversation? Or are you going to feel like I need to go away from this person? So
Mm,
that's number one. I feel like look at the people and make sure that they're great people to work with, and you would enjoy yourself and you would learn things as well from them. uh, the second thing is the problem that the company is going after. Does that actually resonate with you? And are you doing it for that reason, or are you doing it because you just want to get the next job, get the next gig, and then have a landing place and go away? Nothing necessarily wrong with that, but just to be honest with yourself, if you think of it as a 1 to 2 to 3 year journey, at least with this company, it's very important to kind of drive with the pain point. And I do this
mm,
with folks who are joining Galileo as well. Like, why do you want to do this? There are so many really interesting problems out
right.
there that people are solving. Why is the problem of making sure that people can build better models faster important for you? Yeah,
Mm,
and what I've heard is they actually have great answers for this, and you can see it, a visceral reaction in their answers. They're like, "No, this is it. I've been burnt by this so many times. I want to solve for this for everybody." And I'm like, all right, hop on board. So that's the
mm,
second thing. You should feel excited about it, because it's an exciting thing to be in a small company. And the third thing I would say is more financial. And this is, I think, important, but not really something which people think about enough, because there used to be so much money being thrown about in companies in 2021, especially. Uh, I feel like people should learn startup financing and how that works, and learn the ropes of what it means to understand what's the post money valuation of a company, what's the strike price, and where's the company headed, what's the revenue run rate, all of those things to make sure that the health of the company is actually good, and it's
mm.
not folks have just overvalued the hell out of the company, and your stock is not going to be worth much. So I feel like that's also important. I've seen a lot of um, people who I've known, a lot of data scientists who've joined really interesting companies, and from the outside it seems like, this is great, it's a Series C business, they raised a billion, like hundreds of millions of dollars. It's not a good thing.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a good thing. And
Mm.
I think that's a third thing if you're joining an early stage company, to see what's their operating principle and why they made a certain decisions from a financial perspective. I think that's also important to consider when you're going into these things. It's a very real thing that people don't really do the math about.
Yeah. Are there any good resources you recommend, or people should just go Google the some concept you mentioned?
Well, on the financial metrics side, I've seen Carta being a good resource. Carta is
Mm,
this company that is like, does cap table management, but as a
yeah.
part of that, they also publish a lot of really good content about how to
Hmm.
think about cap tables and how to think about the opportunities. So they have a lot of definitions for a bunch of this
Yeah.
stuff.
Cool. Yeah, my current company use Carter to manage the equities
Yeah.
for us. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. So before we wrap up, if people want to get in touch with you or want to try Galileo, want to learn more about it, where can they find you?
You can shoot me an email. You can add me on LinkedIn. I'm on email. I'm Vikram at rungalileo.io. Just feel free to reach out to me at any time about anything related to Galileo or this space of finding these different kinds of problems. I'm more than happy to chat.
Great. Anything else you want to tell our listeners?
You know, I guess like to end, this is a great conversation that I've had, and I would certainly urge people to go to rungalileo.io, shameless plug, and just check out the product and sign up for the waitlist for the LLM studio from there. It's really exciting. But also in general, I think it's a very exciting time to be in the ML AI data science space. It's always been exciting, but just the last 10 to 12 months have been absolutely phenomenal, and it's only going to get more and more interesting. So I feel like there's a lot to learn that people have to keep doing on the job, because a lot of the stuff was not taught in school,
Hmm.
but it's such an exciting time to be in this space.
Yeah. Um, Thanks for sharing your journey and your advice on diagnosing LLMs. Looking forward to see what you do with Galileo in the future.
Absolutely, and it's such a pleasure to be on the show with you, Daliana. Thank you.